When a homeless kid yelled, "Don't eat that," no one could have anticipated the chaos that would unfold. The Mike Café, a sanctuary for the city's affluent, sat elegantly amidst rows of carefully pruned trees and the soft murmur of a nearby fountain. At midday it bustled with life. Waiters in immaculate uniforms glided between tables, balancing trays of artisanal dishes and steaming cups of coffee. The air was infused with a warm aroma of freshly baked bread, mingled with the faint sweetness of blooming flowers. But for one man, the charm of the café went unnoticed. At a central table sat Charles Cams, a name that epitomized wealth and influence. Over decades, he had built a sprawling empire, starting with real estate in his 20s before venturing into industries most people could only dream of. At 81, Charles radiated authority, the kind that came from knowing you controlled not just your own world but perhaps others as well. Clad in a tailored suit and gold-rimmed glasses, he was the embodiment of power. Yet today, as he studied the menu, his movements seemed uncharacteristically deliberate, almost uncertain. Across from him sat Tracy, his much younger wife, a vision of polished perfection. Her jet-black hair framed a face that could have graced any magazine cover, and her scarlet lipstick was applied with flawless precision. She radiated sophistication, though her smile rarely reached her eyes. She twirled a diamond bracelet absent-mindedly, her attention fixed more on her phone than on her husband. Outside the café's patio fence, a boy lingered. He was slight, his oversized hoodie swallowing his small frame, and his dark eyes flitted from table to table. His name was Henry, though no one here knew it. A familiar figure on these streets, he lived on the margins, always skirting the edges of conversations and concern. Henry's stomach growled as he eyed the scene before him. His gaze landed on Charles's table, where a bowl of steaming soup sat beside freshly sliced bread and a glass of water. It was the kind of meal Henry hadn't had in a long time. Charles glanced at his watch, his voice calm but pointed. "You're distracted again." Tracy looked up, her polished smile intact. "I'm right here," she said with an airy sweetness, reaching out to touch his hand. "You know I treasure these lunches." Henry moved closer, his steps barely audible as he leaned against the patio railing. His focus was sharp, his hunger sharpening it further. But then he saw something that made him freeze. As Charles adjusted his glasses and checked his phone, Tracy reached into her designer handbag. Her manicured fingers pulled out a small vial. With practiced ease, she twisted it open and tilted it over the soup. The liquid disappeared instantly, blending seamlessly into the steaming broth. Henry's eyes widened in disbelief. His pulse quickened as he watched her stir the soup casually, her face betraying nothing. She leaned closer to Charles and murmured, her voice low but deliberate, "After everything I've done, you won't mess this up for me now." Henry blinked, his mind struggling to process what he'd just witnessed. Could it really be true? Could someone so polished, seated in such an elegant setting, be capable of something so sinister? A growing sense of dread rooted him to the spot. His heart pounded as he crouched lower behind the patio railing, his thoughts racing. No one else had seen it, no one else was paying attention. It was just him. His stomach growled, trying to pull him back to his own struggles, but he couldn't look away. His eyes remained locked on the couple at the table. Charles looked weary, his attention divided as his spoon hovered over the steaming bowl while he glanced at his phone. Opposite him, Tracy was the picture of poise once again, her bright smile firmly in place, one hand casually resting under her chin. She looked as though she hadn't whispered those chilling words or slipped something into the soup just moments earlier. Henry felt the weight of a decision pressing down on him, heavier than anything he'd ever known. Every instinct screamed at him to walk away. After all, what could he do? Who would listen to a kid like him? Just a scruffy boy in an oversized hoodie, invisible to the world around him. He swallowed hard, his gaze darting around the café. The lively hum of conversations, the clinking of glasses, and bursts of laughter continued as if nothing was wrong. No one noticed him, just as no one noticed the quiet danger at Charles's table. But Henry couldn't shake the memory of what he'd seen. The liquid from that vial, disappearing into the soup. The spoon now inching closer to Charles's lips. He didn't know Charles, his wealth, his power, or his story, but none of that mattered. Wrong was wrong. The moment stretched unbearably, and then, as if propelled by something greater than himself, Henry pushed off the railing. His legs felt like lead, but he moved forward, each step carrying him closer to the table. "Don't eat that," he shouted, his voice cracking with urgency. The cafe seemed to freeze in time. Conversations halted mid-sentence. A fork clattered loudly against a plate. All eyes turned to Henry. Charles stopped mid-motion, his spoon suspended just inches from his lips. His gaze locked on the boy, wide with confusion. Across from him, Tracy's head snapped around, her expression hardening into a cold, sharp mask. "What did you just say?" she demanded, her voice cutting through the shocked silence like a blade. Henry stood his ground, his small frame trembling but resolute. "I saw her," he said, his voice shaking but loud enough for everyone to hear. "She put something in your food. Don't eat it." Gasps rippled through the cafe. Patrons turned in their seats, their curiosity quickly giving way to disbelief and concern. The air grew thick with tension, the lively atmosphere replaced by an oppressive stillness. Henry's chest heaved, adrenaline coursing through him as he held his ground. Charles's eyes flicked between the boy and his wife, his face pale with confusion. Slowly he set the spoon down, his hand trembling. "Tracy," he said, his voice calm but tinged with a steely edge. "What is he talking about?" The question hit like a hammer. Tracy's carefully crafted composure snapped. She shot to her feet, her chair screeching against the stone floor. Her face twisted, the practiced elegance giving way to something raw and unfiltered. "You little liar," Tracy hissed, her voice dripping with venom. "How dare you accuse me of something so disgusting? Who even let you in here?" Her sharp words stung, but Henry refused to back down. He kept his gaze fixed on Charles, willing him to see the truth. "I saw her," Henry repeated, his voice steadier now. "She poured something into your soup when you weren't looking. If you don't believe me, smell it." Charles's expression shifted, his face growing pale. He turned to Tracy, his eyes narrowing as unease crept in. "Tracy," he said quietly but firmly, "what is he talking about?" Tracy scoffed, her laugh brittle and dismissive. She waved her hand as though brushing away an insect. "He's just trying to cause trouble. Look at him. He probably wants money or food," she sneered, her contempt for Henry unmistakable. But Henry didn't flinch. He took a step closer, his small fists clenched at his sides. "I'm not lying," he said, his voice rising with desperation. "I saw her do it. She doesn't want you to know, but I saw everything." Charles hesitated, his hand hovering uncertainly over the bowl. Doubt crept into his mind, spurred by the unyielding conviction in the boy's voice. He looked at Henry, really looked at him this time, and something in the boy's raw determination made him pause. The cafe was deathly silent now. The lively chatter and clinking of silverware had been replaced by a heavy tension as all eyes turned toward the unfolding drama. Charles leaned back in his chair, studying Henry with the sharpness of a man who had seen countless attempts to manipulate his fortune. Yet this felt different. "What's your name?" Charles asked, his voice steady but carrying an edge of suspicion. "Henry," the boy replied, nodding. "And I'm telling the truth. Please don't eat it," he added, his tone softer but filled with urgency. Tracy let out a sharp, bitter laugh, crossing her arms defensively. "This is ridiculous," she snapped, her tone icy. "He's just some street kid looking for attention. Are you seriously going to listen to this nonsense, Charles?" But Charles didn't respond to her. Instead, he picked up the spoon, holding it closer to his face. His hand trembled, not from fear, but from the mounting tension roiling inside him. "Tracy," he said slowly, his voice laced with a quiet demand for the truth. "You heard him. What's going on here?" Tracy's polished mask began to crack. Her lips thinned into a tight line as she snapped, "I can't believe you're even asking me that. It's insulting." She turned to the gathered crowd, her voice rising in frustration. "He's lying. Just look at him. He probably doesn't even know who you are. Why would you trust him over me?" Her words echoed in the tense silence, but they didn't seem to land as she'd hoped. The cafe patrons exchanged glances, their whispers growing louder as their gazes flicked between the three of them. Did she really do it? She looks nervous. That boy doesn't seem like he's lying. The murmurs rippled through the cafe, feeding Tracy's mounting fury. Her hands slammed onto the table, the force sending her perfect composure shattering. "Enough of this, Charles," she snapped, her voice trembling with barely contained rage. "Eat your soup and let's leave." But Henry wasn't backing down. He stepped closer, his fists clenched so tightly his knuckles turned white. "If you don't believe me, then have it tested," he insisted, his voice ringing with determination. "You're rich, you can call anyone to figure it out. But don't eat it. If you do, you'll regret it." Charles's jaw tightened as his gaze shifted to the bowl, the spoon still motionless in his hand. His calculating eyes flicked to Tracy. "You've been acting strangely for weeks, Tracy," he said quietly, his tone measured but pointed. "And this?" Tracy's face turned crimson, her carefully rehearsed charm faltering. I have no idea what you're talking about," she stammered. Charles leaned forward, his voice slicing through her protests. "Poison me." The collective gasp from the cafe patrons was deafening. Whispers erupted like wildfire, growing louder with each passing second. Henry stood his ground, though his heart pounded so fiercely it felt as if it might burst. He had done everything he could. Now the truth, or whatever came next, was out of his hands. Tracy straightened her shoulders, her expression hardening into a mask of defiance. "This is absurd," she spat. "I'm not sitting here and listening to this nonsense." Grabbing her handbag, she made to leave. But Charles's hand darted out, gripping her wrist with unexpected strength. "You're not going anywhere," he said firmly. "Not until we get to the bottom of this." The waiter, who had been frozen like a statue, finally found his voice. "Sir, should I call the police?" The question sent a ripple of unease through the cafe. For the first time, genuine panic flashed across Tracy's face. She shook her head vehemently. "Oh, this is all just a misunderstanding. Charles, you can't seriously." "Call them," Charles interrupted, his voice as sharp as steel. He didn't look away from Tracy as he spoke. Relief flickered across Henry's face, though it was fleeting. The truth wasn't out yet, and the air in the cafe was still thick with tension. The waiter hurried away to make the call, leaving Tracy visibly unraveling. Charles released her wrist, but his piercing gaze stayed fixed on her. The once glamorous facade she had worn so effortlessly had disintegrated, revealing a woman frantically searching for an escape. Henry stood a few steps back, his hands trembling slightly. He had done all he could, but doubt began to creep in. What if Charles didn't believe him? What if Tracy managed to twist the story in her favor? "Henry," Charles said suddenly, his voice cutting through the heavy silence. "You said you saw her put something in the soup. Describe it." Henry nodded quickly and stepped forward. It was a small bottle like a medicine vial. The liquid was clear. "She poured it into the soup when you were looking at your phone, then stirred it." "I swear that's what I saw." Charles's expression hardened as he turned back to Tracy. Her head shook in protest, her voice rising in desperation. "This is absurd. He's lying. Why would I? Why would he lie?" Charles cut her off. What could he possibly gain from this? The murmurs in the cafe grew louder, and the sound of approaching sirens made Tracy visibly flinch. For a fleeting moment, her mask cracked, revealing the fear underneath. Then, as though grasping for control, she turned on Henry. "You've been spying on us, haven't you? Stirring up trouble because you're jealous of people who actually have something." Her accusation hit Henry like a blow, but he didn't waver. "I'm not jealous," he said, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "I saw what you did, and I couldn't just stand by and let you hurt him." The sirens grew deafening as 2 police officers entered the cafe. The room seemed to shrink as they approached, their hands resting on their belts, and the crowd held its collective breath. As 2 police officers entered, one of them asked with authority, "What's going on here?" Charles, rising from his chair, still exuded an air of power despite his age. "Officers, I need you to look at this," he said, motioning to the bowl of soup. "This boy claims my wife poisoned it." The officers exchanged silent glances before one leaned in to sniff the soup and then turned to Tracy. "Ma'am, do you have anything to say?" Her face flushed with anger. "This is absurd. He's just a street kid trying to stir up trouble. Charles, you're actually entertaining this." The officer remained calm. "We'll need to test the contents," he said, reaching for the soup. Tracy snapped. "No." Her outburst only made her appear more guilty. The officer paused, scrutinizing her. "Ma'am, is there something you'd like to share before we proceed?" Tracy hesitated, her breath quickening as she glanced between Charles and the officers, gripping her handbag tightly. Then, as if unable to stop herself, she blurted out, "Fine. You want the truth. I'm sick of living under his thumb. I've wanted him gone for so long," and she stopped abruptly, realizing her mistake. The cafe erupted in shocked gasps, with some patrons recording the moment. Charles's face went pale, the weight of her confession crashing down on him. The officer stepped forward, his voice grim. "Ma'am, I'm arresting you for attempted murder. Please put your hands where I can see them." Tracy screamed, struggling against their grip as they handcuffed her. "You don't understand. I deserved everything he had," she shouted as they led her away, her voice echoing in the stunned cafe. Charles sank back into his chair, his hand shaking as he pushed the bowl aside. He sat in stunned silence for a moment, his face a mix of disbelief and betrayal. Then his gaze found Henry, still frozen in place. For a fleeting moment, Charles's expression softened. Gratitude flickered in his eyes. Henry had not only saved his life but had also uncovered a truth that Charles never would have suspected. The cafe returned to quiet murmurs, the patrons still processing what had just unfolded. Some looked at Charles with pity, others with curiosity. Henry stood motionless, unsure if he should stay or slip away. Finally Charles spoke, his voice soft but firm. "Henry," he said, gesturing to the seat across from him. "Sit." Henry hesitated, glancing at the onlookers, but Charles's commanding tone compelled him to comply. Slowly he sat down, his body tense with uncertainty. Charles looked at Henry, his voice full of gratitude. "You saved my life. I can't even begin to express how grateful I am." Henry shifted uncomfortably in his seat, avoiding eye contact. I couldn't stay quiet. I couldn't let it happen." Charles considered this for a moment. Most people would have turned away, pretended they didn't see anything. But you didn't. That took a lot of courage. Henry shrugged, his voice barely audible. "I just can't stand seeing people hurt. That's all." Charles studied him, seeing something deeper than just a street kid. "How long have you been out there?" he asked quietly. Henry hesitated, looking away, his embarrassment clear. "A while." Charles didn't press, but instead pulled out his phone. "Wait here," he said, stepping aside to make a call. Henry stayed where he was, feeling a pang of nervousness. Was he in trouble now? Was Charles going to have him removed? When Charles returned, he seemed more at ease. "Help is on the way," he said. "Help?" Henry echoed, confused. Charles nodded. "I called someone I trust. They'll find you a safe place to sleep tonight. And if you'll let me, I'd like to do more for you." Henry's eyes widened. "You don't have to do that," he said quickly. "I didn't do it for money or anything." Charles smiled slightly. "No. That's why I want to help. You did something most wouldn't, and that deserves something in return. If there were more people like you, the world would be better." For the first time in a long time, Henry felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years: warmth. He looked down, unsure of what to say. The cafe began to empty, but the feeling in the air lingered. Charles sipped his water and then spoke again. "Sometimes life gives us a chance to change someone else's path. You changed mine today, Henry. And maybe, just maybe, I can help change yours." Henry's eyes filled with something soft, a flicker of hope that had long been absent. As the two sat in silence, the day stretched on, and the lesson from that moment was clear. Courage doesn't always come from the people we expect, and kindness can come from the most unlikely places. Sometimes, it's the ones we overlook who carry the greatest strength. In the end, Henry's bravery didn't just save a life. It reminded everyone of the profound impact that standing up for what's right can have, no matter who you are. If this story touched you, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and join us for more tales of courage, truth, and redemption. Share this video with someone who might need a reminder that even the smallest actions can create life-changing impacts.